All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, morning, whatever it might be for you. Welcome to this webinar. So we're going to spend the next probably 45 minutes together, and I'm excited to introduce some of our latest features with you today, and I'm going to also share a little bit about our roadmap. So my name is Wietse. I am one of the co-founders and I'm the CEO of GoVocal. You have this little code here. I love always connecting with practitioners. So if you want to connect on LinkedIn, feel free to scan this code. I would love to also learn more about your work as you will be learning about our work today. And I would also invite you all to just share in the chat where you're calling from today. So where you're based. It's always nice to see where people are dialing in from. And I'm based out of Brussels. I see that we have people from Vancouver, Austria, Lambeth, England, Ontario, Maryland. So keep it coming. For everyone for whom English is not the first language, we have captions available. So if on Zoom, if you go to that bar at the bottom, then there will be the option to show captions. So I will try my best to speak slowly and understandable for the Zoom feature to nicely translate what I'm saying to whatever language you prefer. Here's the agenda for today. So we're first going to look at some of the challenges that we started from, the practitioners' challenges. And then from there, I'm going to give you an overview of what's new in the GoVocal platform. And we will end with a demonstration of some of those features. There will be time for Q&A, so I hope to take about 30 minutes to give an introduction of the features and of the roadmap. And then there will be time for you to ask questions. So if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. There is this dedicated Q&A functionality. And then at the end, I will go through all your questions. So that's the easiest for us all. A little bit about GoVocal. Most of you who are here are familiar with us, but I just want to spend a couple of seconds, a couple of sentences on who we are. We are working globally with local governments, cities, municipalities, councils, and we're supporting them to engage better with their community. So we support about 600 local governments. You see some of them here. So that's from Europe and the UK to North America, South Africa and Australia. And we're really proud of the recognition that we got from the People Power team, who rated us as the #1 participation platform, #1 engagement platform amongst all the different participation tools out there. Now, what do we have in store for today? What are those new updates? Today, I invite you all to get into the shoes of Vanessa, and probably those are your own shoes. So Vanessa, she is the Director of Community Engagement of the City of Greenville. And we will be following her journey, some of the dilemmas that she faced, some of the challenges she faced, and how we have tried to solve some of those challenges. She has three specific challenges that she brought to us. The first challenge is, well, I would love to know who is participating, because my managers and council, they need to know this in order to see that it's whether it's representative or not, the input. But I struggle to still get that engagement if I have that upfront barrier of asking people for their demographics. So the first thing is really about the tension between maximizing engagement and still getting that data, demographics, to understand who is participating. The second challenge is, well, I engage through paper forms. We have the option for people to fill out forms, but it takes me so long to actually digitize those forms, and so I never really get to it. And then the third challenge is when we go for more open forms of ideation, of dialogue, of discussion, it's really hard to drive high quality conversations at scale. Because once you get to a certain volume, ideas get lost, there's a bunch of duplicates piling up. And for residents, they complain that it's really hard to navigate conversations and to find their place to contribute. So these are three challenges that Vanessa is facing. Quick poll, which one of those three is most familiar or sounds most familiar to you? So we're gonna launch a quick poll. I'll give you just 20 seconds. It's a fairly straightforward question, and you can let us know which one of those three is the most familiar to you. So to our team, if you can launch the poll. I don't see this popping up. I guess we're struggling. My colleague might be struggling with the poll. At least I don't see it, so I'm gonna um, just gonna keep moving and quickly open the chat. Oh, we did launch it. Then I'm just not seeing it as a host. I'm not seeing the results, so I'm going to continue. So first challenge: registration lowers engagement. I'm sure this is a recognizable feeling. And by the way, Guillaume, to my colleague, oh yeah, there we go. Okay, I appreciate it. I will share the results. And yes, this is very much a recognizable challenge, balancing participation and capturing the demographics. So we see that is actually the number one challenge. So let's zoom in on that one. What have we done here? How have we thought about this particular challenge? Well, so we have now available a new feature for what we call optional and deferred registration. I will show you this in the demo. It's basically that instead of asking upfront, hey, who are you? Please register and tell us more about your demographics. We allow people to get through the participation flow, share their input, share their idea, and then only at the end, ask them optionally one for their demographics and optionally two, ask them whether they want to sign up and whether they want to stay connected to hear what has happened with their input and get to all the benefits of actually registering as a user. So instead of front loading it and having that upfront barrier, we're bringing it to the end of the user flow, leading to more participation and allowing you to get out of that dilemma of should I do the one or the other. You can do both, and people can optionally sign up to stay connected. The second challenge, listening at scale, becomes really difficult once you get to a good volume of contributions because it's all scattered, it's repetitive, and it's the most popular ideas that bubble up, but all the other ones, they go to the bottom of the feed, and it's, as they say for Google, that by page 2, nobody gets to page 2, and all those ideas are not really getting seen, not getting the comments, not getting the engagement. So that was a really challenging thing for us to solve and to look at, and a very important one, because if we want to have better deliberation in participation, this is critical. And so how have we thought about this? We are launching a new feature called Perspectives. And Perspective, it's making use of artificial intelligence to bring clarity to conversations, to help residents navigate large-scale conversations in two ways. The first way, what you see here on the left-hand side, we are summarizing the conversations. So we are actually showing what are the main topics that are being talked about and what are the subtopics, and translate in a way so that people in one sentence can understand what's been really talked about. Formulated as questions, not as opinionated statements, but as questions to think about some of those issues and really prompting people to contribute to that conversation. Secondly, what you can see here, we have a new interface to navigate conversations. So it's called the Perspectives feed, where you have all sorts of post-its. And what's really the innovation that we brought to this view is that we have thought about how do we do the bridging, how do we actually filter out the right ideas to show. And instead of going by a one-dimensional, show me the most popular, the most voted, or the newest ones, we went for a smart combination of having, on the one hand, looking at representativeness. So we want to make sure that different participants are represented, a diversity of topics in the second place. Thirdly, we also looked at what are some wise voices, some lived experiences in the community. So we actually look for lived experiences. And then obviously the last one are the more classic dimensions of recency. What are the trending topics? Those 4 dimensions, we combine them into a feed. And this is really intended to optimize listening. We have been thinking about how do we make sure that in online conversations, people listen to relevant high signal inputs from their fellow residents. So that is what we've been working on, and I will show you this later. Third challenge, offline input gets left behind. People participate online, but also offline. And those offline forms, they might end up on your desk without ever making it to a digital format, and that way not being considered. Or you do it, but it takes you a lot of time, and it's something we can do better. That might be easier these days. So we already had our FormSync 1.0, and the initial version of FormSync did what the second version is doing, but it comes with a way higher accuracy, the second version. We have been working on the accuracy. We want to make sure it's way more reliable. So some of you who have been trying out FormSync might have experienced this in the past, that we had an accuracy of, let's say, 60% roughly. We have been able to bring this up to 95% plus. So there have been really fantastic performance improvements. I'm going to show you an example later on. I just scribbled something right before this webinar, and I'm going to show you what I gives when I scan it. And then the fourth challenge, insights get buried in the data. Insights are very hard to find in the data. So we need a way for project managers to get to a better understanding, because again, for especially some of our clients who are here today, you might recognize that all the data is sitting in the platform. And as an admin, you have access to all the data. You can go from your representativeness dashboard into the different projects. But as a project manager, I want to know everything about my project, from visitors to representativeness to the actual sense making. And so we've designed new dashboards, project dashboards, that help you with exactly this. So those phase dashboards, they also adjust to the method that you're using. And they're a combination of all the essential KPIs you have to know for your project. And there's also one really cool delighter coming with this, which I'll keep for the demo to show you. The fifth challenge, now we're getting more to the part that we're currently working on. Now we're getting more to the roadmap part. The fifth challenge, which I'm sure all of you recognize, is you're doing many, many different things as practitioners. Many people are working on communications or are part of a communications team. So it's not only engagement, it's also like doing many other things like the newsletter and the communication that's coming with it, the offline events you might be facilitating, and much, much more. Now, what we have heard that can really help to make that project management easier for you to hit your deadlines and get through all the tasks is a scheduling feature. A feature to allow you to schedule projects, to schedule phases, to schedule emails, so that you can plan ahead and don't have to do it always ad hoc when it needs to go out. So from now on, there are features in the platform for you to schedule on specific dates, specific times, you can send out those email notifications, plan those again for a specific time. So this is something that is coming up soon in the platform. And then the last one that I want to touch on that is really exciting is, as we see more and more cities, councils using it with many different project managers, often 100 internal project managers or more, this comes with a challenge of how do you actually get everyone streamlined, everyone aligned, because different teams might be using different tools or might have different ways of working, different procedures. So what we built is spaces, or what we are building, I should say, because this is currently in development. Spaces or workspaces, they allow you in the backend to have a middle layer and to have different teams working together in their own dedicated space. Today you have the view as an admin, then you have folders and the projects. But what we're creating is a space in which you can have multiple projects, multiple folders restricted to that space. And we designed this with the different departments in mind. So as you see here on the screenshot, it can be for the Parks and Rec department, it can be for public safety. You could also do it in a way they organize it per neighborhood, if that would be the way that you're working, into different service areas. That's really up to you. But so what can you do within one such a workspace? It will allow you, first of all, to have your dashboard, so your data at the space level. All the data you get to see, all the data you should be able to access, but then specifically for your department, for your workspace. The roles and permissions can be set also within that workspace, because for your department, there might be multiple roles. So you'll be able to really customize those to the different people in your space. And something that might be coming later is SCIM provisioning. So what is this? This stands for System for Cross-Identity Management. Basically, with your single sign-on, that you can do very easily the user management. We hear often from especially the larger cities and the more, let's say, digital mature organizations, that they have internally a system for user management. Often that's intra ID, and that they would love actually to automatically match people to the right department when people leave, that they would be able to get out of the space when they join, that they have access to it. So that whole user management, making that easier, would also be part of it. So I'm really excited about this one, creating separate spaces for especially large organizations to get structured and to get organized. Now, let's have a look at some live examples here. So I'm going to show you in a minute an example on my demo platform of many of the things that I've been just going through. But maybe first some context. I will be showing you our perspectives, and I'm going to just share a little bit about like what was initially the source of inspiration. We had about a year ago, we did in the UK with the NHS a large conversation on the future of healthcare for the NHS for next 10 years. And we had 10,000 of ideas, and we had more than 100,000 participants. It was really hard to navigate that conversation. And as we thought about like large scale conversation, large scale dialogues, there was one coming up with in the United States with the state of South Carolina, the South Carolina Forum, which is all about, hey, if there is one problem to solve, what should it be? It's a cross-partisan initiative to think about the state priorities and to make policy at state level. And we're going to be doing that in multiple states in the United States. And as you see here, this just got live. This is already like more than 460 plus inputs. And so we co-designed this with them to make it easy to navigate that conversation. So I just want to share this because you'll see some of those examples here on my Greenville demo platforms that have been inspired by that. So here I'm going to my demo platform. I'm going to click into this big conversation. Let's bring ideas to our region. And as you see here in this first phase, issue mapping. So we want to know if there is one issue we should solve, what should it be? And you're all familiar, or most of you, with this traditional list view. And again, this is easy for a relatively low volume of inputs. But once you get into the hundreds, it becomes very difficult because you need to keep scrolling and scrolling, especially on mobile. This is very hard because there's limited space. And in general, we have 2/3 of the participants coming in through mobile. So that's why we built this feed here. Now, let me first think about an idea. So let's go through an example and submit an idea. So perhaps our idea would be, or my idea would be, to work on infrastructure development. The first thing we will see here is, well, Jonathan here, he has apparently also posted already an idea about infrastructure development. So this is where we're scanning for duplicates. So we're going to be looking for similar ideas based on semantics and the similarity, because we always want people to engage with each other to build on top of each other's ideas as opposed to posting duplicates. Now, infrastructure development investments, I'll just add some more here. Let's fix the potholes. We'd love to have access to better infrastructure. Here, the second screen asks me about my demographics. Up to you to set this to optional or make it mandatory. So I'll just do this. From Rally, and then I will submit. And now here we're getting to the view where I'm encouraged to actually sign up and create an account. So this is what we added at the end of the participation flow. Now people, they can easily create an account or log in, and that is the way for them to stay connected and to get updates, to get notifications, to know what has happened with their input. Now I won't do that now, and I will just go back to our feed here. This is the new view that we have created to navigate conversations. What do we see here? We see on the left-hand side the different topics that are being talked about. So we see infrastructure and transportation is the #1 issue. Secondly, governance, political reform. I see education quality, affordable housing has been mentioned, and a few more. If I then click in, I see more specific issues being mentioned. So the growth is outpacing road capacity. So the rapid population growth is causing congestion, longer commute times. So this is one specific issue. And then I see here, well, the same idea that I was actually trying to duplicate, this idea from Jonathan, and I can easily scroll through that feed. Now, something I would love you to see is also how this behaves on mobile. So now I'm getting into mobile view. And you see here on your mobile, you would get a little explainer animation to show you how to easily go from one to the other posted card, your idea card. So it's very easy. I could then Tinder like swipe to the left, swipe to the right to vote. I could easily pull up the tags here and get into another topic, roads perhaps. And so this would be a way for me to super quickly navigate all those different ideas. If I'm interested in an idea, then I would click on it and would get into the idea view here on the left-hand side. So this is a way better way to navigate conversations, to make them scalable, to give overview to the residents and actually have an understanding of what's been talked about. Now, let me log in and take you to our backend. So I was hoping this would automatically pre-populate because I can't remember which account I would be using. Let me just try this one. All right, I might do that with my moderator account. Fingers crossed. Oh, that's great. I hope I get in with this one. Hooray. I'm happy that worked. All right, good. So now let's look into our backend. And I want to show you two things here. So I was earlier talking about the offline uploads. So let's have a look at how that has improved. So let's find our new project that we're just looking at. There was this one, the big conversation. And let's get to our importer. Now, I want you first to see what I scribbled down right before the webinar. And I hope you can see this well. So I printed the form and I started filling it out. So I added, this is my handwriting. You can judge yourself how much it looks like the one from your doctor. So it's a pretty ugly scribble, and this is what this gives us. So you see here for instance, I had first my last name here as well. So scribble here, email address. So it's not all super clear, but it does a fantastic job at recognizing it. I also uploaded, for instance, I'll just make this a little smaller so you can see this for a moment. This was the last page. There's a second page. And here you see my handwriting, not optimal, but it works wonders. It works really fantastically well. So you see here, what's also beautiful is I had this idea for, hey, we want to see more parks in the state for younger families. And here's a similar idea that's already been posted on people wanting to see more playgrounds. And it does take the input here. Again, I will scroll out for a moment. You see here, we don't have enough public space to entertain our children without private gardens. There's just not enough recreational space. And it takes exactly that input from my handwriting here. Same with all the different demographics I had here. So it works really well. It got to a point that the technology has matured a lot. So I would encourage you all, if you had previously the experience of, this is not always reliable, try it out again. There have been some serious improvements to the accuracy. Now, the other thing I want to show you are the face dashboards. So we have a new tab here within each of the faces. It's called Insights. And on the Insights tab, we have as I shared earlier, we have all the essential KPIs. So number of visitors, number of participants, inputs, reactions, and so on. Again, this is dummy data, so it's not, as you can see, not most meaningful, but it's just to illustrate it. Your participation over time together with the visitors. And what we have brought to this dashboard is also the representativeness. So if you have on your platform your census data uploaded, you will be able to compare the actual participation for each project to the census data to see where do we have stakeholder gaps and where are we good. So let's look, for instance, at the year of birth. We see here that in general, there's 23% of the of the community that is between 45 and 54, but only 15% has participated, or of the participants in this project. So there is a gap here. There's a clear signal. Whereas other groups, this one here and that one here, they are overrepresented. So this is really meaningful data for you to know where should we go into the neighborhoods, where should we go into the community, who should we talk to, what other communication efforts should we focus on to make sure that this is a representative sample. What else do we see here on the dashboard? We see what people are talking about. So we see here the AI summary, which I can show you in a moment, together with distribution of the different topics. Both the AI distribution, so again, infrastructure, education, you see all the different tags here, as well as the manual ones. These are the ones that participants have selected when they uploaded their ideas. See the most liked ones, we have a status breakdown, so I can explore that as well. Now, one other problem that many of our clients were facing is it's great to have those styles and those dashboards, but when I have to report to council, it has to be in a certain format. So I need more flexibility to make my own reports. So what we're adding is also an export to Word format so that you can play with the data and that you can actually create your own graphs or style your own document. So we export the data, you have it here available in a clean way so that you can start playing with it in your own Word. So those are the different things I wanted to show you today. I'm going back to my slides for a moment to recap what I've just shown you. So we have now available those three features I just showed you. The deferred registration, it's live. The phase dashboards are live, and perspectives, it's also ready to use. So these three features are available now. The two features that are coming soon are spaces and scheduling. These are two features we are right now working on. Form sync, there have been already serious improvements brought to production, so they are live. We will continue to work on it a little more, especially also to give you feedback on the accuracy and the reliability through the platform. So this will continuously also land in your platform, but try it out already because it has become so much better already. And for those two here, get in touch if you would like to get a preview or if you would like to help us shape it, as it's fully in development right now. So I see that it's sturdy, which is great. So we have now some time for questions. Should there be any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and then happy to get these answered. I see there are some in the Q&A. All right. Okay, I will pick one from, I see here one question, which is the question of how do we know, or how can we tell which experience are lived experience, which voices are wise? That's a great question. So we look for indicators such as prompts such as a young mom, I experienced this. So it's often about role identification. So someone sharing, hey, in this capacity or in this role, I experienced this. So those are some of the things that that we would be looking for in the way that an idea gets expressed. So really kind of jotting it down as an experience as opposed to you saw my idea, which was, hey, let's improve, let's fix the potholes, but I don't give an indication. If I were to say like, hey, I drive that road from here to there on a daily basis, and this is what I experience. It's way more lived experience. It's a wiser voice, and let's fix the potholes. So those are really the elements we would be looking for. There was a question. I'm trying to just get through all the questions, but I might need some more specification on some. So feel free. I think you should be able to see the question now. Feel free to open your mic if you want to give some extra context, because I think some of the questions were referring to a specific feature, and it's hard to know which one that was. But there is a question on once they have filled out said engagement, say they don't want to give any information, what happens to their feedback? I believe this will probably refer back to the deferred registration. So if they don't sign up, yeah, there is no way for us or for you to actually know who is participating and to give feedback, so they won't receive a notification. So I hope I'm getting the question right. Feel free to open your mic if it was if it was about something else, but I assume it was linked to that. All right. I'll pick the next one. When automating the project launch, can you set when the project will close? Also, can same be done on a tool basis, meaning launching survey on X date and then scheduling quick poll at a later date? The answer to those questions is yes, yes, and yes. So the cases you describe, that's really what it's been built for. Start date, end date. So closing can also be automated. You can do that on a phase basis. So it's not just for a project, but really do it phase by phase. So you could say, hey, survey on this date, and then a follow up on that date for next phase. So it is on a pretty granular level, and it should be able to meet kind of the use cases you have in mind. So there's a question on what's the advice on when to use a classic ideation versus the new perspectives view? That's a great question. I would say if you want to collect quick ideas and they don't require further deliberation and dialogue, use the classic view. It's easy to navigate. It's easy to scroll through it, and you don't need kind of the additional bridging that we're bringing to it now based on the representativeness and wise voices. You don't need the summary. So if you don't expect more than, let's say, 100 ideas, stick to the classic view. If you do expect like a large scale dialogue, more than 100 inputs, and where you want people to really listen and read each other's ideas, then go for the perspectives view. All right, keep them coming. So in perspectives, does the swiping, does that create likes or dislikes? Yes, indeed. It's like that way you would be able to like and to dislike. So that is indeed the idea. Another question is about offline uploads. Do they only work for form or also for other formats? Yes, so I've now just shown like form sync and how it works for handwritten input, but we also have our 360 input, which I didn't get to right now for the demo, but it also allows you to upload audio files, and then those will be automatically transcribed and chapters will be created. So it works, our 360 input works for multiple formats, including handwriting, but also for other formats. So there is a question about for the insights, if a project is limited to an area, will the stats show the demographic representativeness strictly for that area? That is a great question. And the answer is no, it won't. As in, it's actually a great question because I could see the use case. You would want to upload your demographics per area as opposed to for the whole, let's call it city. So you want to know it on a neighborhood level, not on a city level, because demographics might be very different. Today it's one dimensional. So it's an upload for the whole constituency, the whole city, not kind of tailored area per area. But I could definitely see a great use case there, and we'll definitely take that along. So there is a question about, is there a prompt and a query function column for data analysis, just in case you want to prompt the AI analysis on certain interest on the data? Yes, absolutely. Also here, I didn't get to demoing really the AI sense making today because this is something we have had in the platform for a longer time. But there's absolutely the possibility to use the Q&A functionality. I might actually show that real quick, just so that you're aware of that in case you're less familiar with the product. So I will now just go to, again, that same project that we were looking at. And now I'm getting taken into the sense making view. So you see here, there's about 178 different ideas. You see all the different tags here. I could actually break down those ideas into different clusters. It can be by topic, but it could also be by sentiment, for instance, controversy, labels that I want to classify onto. And then for each of those, I could run a summary. So I could summarize each of the clusters. I could also go, of course, with a summary on it all. So as you see here, but I could also ask a question. So I could also ask, what are concerns on, let's say, infrastructure? Then this is also a way for me to query the data and to actually play with the data. So you see here, people are talking about transport and roads, digital infrastructure, utilities and services. And what's really key in the way that we design our AI is that you can always go back to the original input from the community. So those little footnotes, those references that you see here, they help you always to look back at the original inputs, which is right now for this one not working. So let me just click here because it's still running. That's why it's not working yet. So you see here social justice and equity, erasure of Black history, and you see like people are talking about it in those different ideas. All right, so let me see. This one get answered, and then I see here two more questions. I'll take this one. It appears representativeness is based on only those who have signed up for an account. So for engagement exercises that do not need account creation, we won't be able to track representativeness. Is this correct? So there's two things. As you might have seen when I posted that idea, the first screen was, what's your idea? The second screen was, tell us more, gives your demographics. And then the third screen was, do you actually want to turn this into an account? And do you want to stay in loop? So 2 and 3 are different views. We can collect the demographics. And then irrespective of you creating an account, this can be added to actually the demographic data. So in other words, those can be split. You could know how representative is this, even if people do not create an account on the platform in that specific project. And then a last one, keep it coming, by the way, if you have any other questions. I see here one last one. Is it possible that insights are not visible in information phases? Would still be interesting to motivate project leaders to add a feedback loop as it shows there are still many visitors. That's a great question. This is something I would need to ask the product team. I haven't tested it out myself for the information pages, whether it would show reports. So I can't confirm that, but I could see the use case there, and I'll definitely check that out and let you know, Ellen. All right, we've been through all our different questions here. So I see there's one more in the chat. Survey as draft. When will it be possible to share entire consultation, including survey as draft option with project consultation owner? I'm not sure to fully get that question. I'm not sure to get the question, so feel free to open your mic if you want to clarify. Otherwise, I'm just going to wrap us up here because yeah, feel free to open your mic. I see that you have your hand raised, so feel free to, if you want to ask your question, go for it.
Hello. Hello,
Hello.
do you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, it
I can hear
because it's on the phone, it took me for a while to find the
you.
the feature of the mic.
Yeah,
It was
no worries.
hidden tiny in the corner. So
No worries.
apologies for that. So apparently our ongoing issue is when, like, let's say the way we operate in our local authority with public consultations, projects, surveys, sometimes our other departments, they are giving for us just, drafted documents. I sit on the platform. I upload entire, service questions, the description, everything. And if we want to share without publishing with the project owner, with other departments, how that consultation is going to look like. And specifically,
I see.
there is curiosity, how the survey looks like, especially when it's coming to matrix type style questions, or if map is included. Apparently, if we are sharing, they can see only description, but they don't have access to survey unless it's published. So if I will go to publish, I'm a little bit worried, is it going to be like, pinged other users that there is a new consultation landed, and then, I will
Yes.
go to draft mode again. So I don't want to trigger, unnecessary, kind of pings
Gotcha. Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
confusion
Absolutely.
of users.
Yeah, gotcha. But you're right. I mean, it should be in the preview of your project. So there you should
Yeah,
be able to actually get to see that and share that and get feedback from your colleagues.
yeah.
Um, so
It's
that's
possible
where
to share the link, but apparently if project owners, let's say another department, they are not registered on the platform because sometimes it can be one off
yeah, gotcha. Yeah,
project,
yeah, yeah.
so they don't want to register, they don't want to be there. So if we are sharing link, they cannot access the survey, they cannot see the visuals of the survey
When they're not
unless it's published.
Yeah, yeah, when they're not registered. Yeah,
Yeah,
that is indeed like that would be a consideration or that's also good, I guess, feedback to us like, hey, we shouldn't need registration in that case. We also do that a bit as a security measure to know that, hey, these are effectively people from
yeah.
city
So
staff.
we had a phrase attending one, of our internal community engagement network sessions. So I suggested to Fraser, I said maybe we could, it can be established by a IT team, from your side,
Yeah.
that maybe if we are sharing some draft link, it will be valid, maybe like, let's say, for an
Yeah,
hour,
yeah.
or for half
But,
an hour, and then it's, it disappearing.
but
They saw it and that's it.
we're gonna take that offline. I would love to
Okay,
continue the conversation, but I want to make sure that because some people
okay.
might want to. But
Okay. I just
I can.
wanted to highlight that to
Yeah,
you, and that's it.
share. Yeah, thank you. Share, please, in your name or send me a quick note
Yeah.
because I cannot see who you are because it's like a coded name. But thanks
Oh
for
my
your
God.
question. I would love
Okay.
to understand it a bit
Okay.
further.
Okay.
But I also want
Thank you.
to make sure that for all the others, because I said we would take 45 minutes, I just want to make sure we stop on time. I'm going to just end by announcing our next global webinar. It's going to be early next month and it's going to be not necessarily product focused. It's going to be more focused on the bigger picture of how do we run smooth workflows. So we have done with our clients at the end of last year. We have surveyed our clients. We asked them about, hey, how do you actually work today? How does that workflow look like? We found kind of a model for which people said 87% of our clients, local government said this is actually the way we work. And we've been really focused on optimizing that workflow. So we are going to be talking about workflows. We're going to be talking about internal efficiency, streamlining the way they work together internally. We're going to be addressing some of those biggest bottlenecks that are there. So if you want to join us early next month, I believe it's going to be the 6th, then feel free to scan this code, sign up so that you're staying in the loop, and get the calendar invites, and then we hope to see you there. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for having been here. Thanks for your engagement, for the questions. And again, if you want to get in touch, my LinkedIn was here earlier, I believe in the chat. Here's a link if you want to schedule a call with one of my colleagues, whether it's to know more about those features or to get a demo, feel free to scan this code. And then I will just end by saying thank you so much for being here. Have a lovely day and hope to see you early next month. Bye bye.